Oh my God! Karen was pointing her Glock straight at my daughter's head, her hand shaking like an addict going through withdrawal. That was the moment I nearly became a murderer, only to discover that my supposedly unemployed daughter was actually carrying out a secret mission for the DEA. Never underestimate a single mom and her daughter, especially when they both have connections to law enforcement. Where are you watching this video from? Drop a comment below because my story will show you exactly how I brought down an entire criminal empire disguised as an HOA. It all started 6 months ago when I moved to Ridgewater Estates, a seemingly peaceful suburban neighborhood with perfectly manicured lawns and coordinated mailboxes. As a 42-year-old single mom and former military intelligence officer, I was just looking for a fresh start in a safe community where I could build a new life after leaving the service. The property was affordable, in a good school district, not that my 24-year-old daughter Brittany needed that anymore, and close enough to my new civilian job at Pinnacle Insurance. What I didn't realize was that this picture-perfect neighborhood, with its rigid rules about lawn height and approved exterior paint colors, was actually the front for something much darker. I first met Karen Harrison during the homeowners orientation meeting my second week there. She was a trim woman in her mid-50s with salt and pepper hair and a perpetual scowl that only softened when she was talking to certain residents, none of whom were women. I noticed she wore that HOA president badge like it was a police shield, which I later learned wasn't far from the truth. "We run a tight ship here at Ridgewater," she explained while looking down her nose at me through designer sunglasses. "The rules aren't suggestions, Ms. Hayes. They're requirements. People move here because they appreciate structure and order." Something about her demeanor immediately rubbed me the wrong way, the familiar power trip I'd seen countless times in my military career from small people desperately clinging to whatever authority they could grasp. During that first meeting, I also noticed Blake Mitchell, a burly ex-Army Ranger who seemed to function as Karen's right-hand man. He stood at the back of the room, arms crossed over his chest, eyeing newcomers with suspicion. Whenever Karen made a particularly strict pronouncement about the rules, Blake would nod approvingly, occasionally adding comments like "structure builds community" or "rules exist for a reason, folks." There was an unsettling synchronicity to their behavior, as though they'd rehearsed this good cop/bad cop routine countless times before. The other board members seemed almost decorative by comparison, present but largely silent, deferring to Karen on every decision. This power dynamic struck me as unusual for what should have been a democratic neighborhood association, but I chalked it up to small pond politics and decided to keep my head down. I'll admit that I wasn't particularly concerned at first. After spending 12 years in military intelligence dealing with actual life and death situations in areas of conflict, a power-tripping HOA president seemed like a minor annoyance at worst. I figured I could fly under the radar, follow their arbitrary rules, and focus on building my new life. The job at Pinnacle Insurance wasn't exactly what I dreamed of doing after the military, but it provided stability and decent benefits. After the intensity of my previous career, there was something appealing about the predictable rhythm of civilian life, even with Karen's petty tyranny as an occasional disruption. If only things had stayed that simple. Things might have stayed merely annoying if Brittany hadn't shown up on my doorstep 3 weeks later. My brilliant daughter, with her summa cum laude degree in criminal justice and financial analysis, claimed she was between jobs and needed a place to stay, just for a few months while working remotely for a small software company. I knew my daughter, knew her expressions, her tells, the way her left eyebrow twitched slightly when she wasn't being entirely truthful. As a mother, I could sense something was off, but I kept my concerns to myself. After all, she was an adult now, and I respected her privacy. Still, it was strange to watch her coming and going at odd hours, taking calls in hushed tones from the bathroom with the shower running, and occasionally returning home with mysterious bruises she blamed on joining a new kickboxing gym. What struck me most was the change in her demeanor. The vibrant, open young woman who had shared everything with me throughout her college years had been replaced by someone more guarded, more measured in her responses. When I asked about her new job, she would provide just enough detail to sound convincing without actually revealing anything substantial. "It's mostly back-end development stuff, Mom. Trust me, you'd be bored to tears if I explained it. But there was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before, a hyper-awareness of her surroundings that reminded me of my own early days in intelligence work. Sometimes I would catch her scanning rooms for exits or checking her reflection in windows to see if anyone was behind her, behaviors I recognized because they had once been my own. One evening, I came home early from work to find Brittany in her bedroom with papers spread across her bed, papers she quickly gathered and shoved into a folder when she heard me at the door. "Just some work stuff," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Later that night, while she was in the shower, my curiosity got the better of me. I knew I shouldn't invade her privacy, but maternal instinct and professional paranoia made a powerful combination. In her desk drawer, beneath some ordinary office supplies, I found a burner phone, the kind used when you don't want calls traced, and a small notebook with dates, times, and what appeared to be code names. My heart raced. Either my daughter was involved in something illegal, or she was working in some capacity that required intense security measures. Neither possibility gave me much comfort. By the end of my first month at Ridgewater, I'd already received 2 violation notices from the HOA. The first was for leaving my recycling bin out 5 hours longer than permitted. The second was for planting unapproved flowers in my front garden bed, flowers that had literally been there when I bought the house. When I tried to appeal the fines at the monthly HOA meeting, I was quickly shut down by Karen, who seemed to take particular pleasure in enforcing rules against newer residents, especially single women. What I found especially strange was how some long-term residents, particularly those on Karen's advisory committee, seemed to get away with much more serious violations without consequence. The financial aspect of these violations also raised my suspicions. Each fine was surprisingly steep: $100 for the recycling bin, $200 for the unapproved flowers, and payment was required in cash or money order, with no option for credit cards or checks. When I asked about digital payment options, Karen dismissed the question with a wave of her hand. "We find traditional payment methods work best for our community." It was an odd stance for a neighborhood association in the 21st century, especially one that otherwise seemed obsessed with documenting every minor infraction with digital photographs and time-stamped records. I found myself wondering if I was overreacting. Perhaps my years in intelligence had made me see patterns and threats where none existed, but then I started noticing other inconsistencies. The community newsletter mentioned capital improvements that never materialized. The security cameras at the clubhouse entrance were positioned to capture residents' comings and goings rather than potential outside threats. At social events, Karen and Blake would circulate separately, engaging different groups in conversation, but occasionally exchanging meaningful glances as if comparing notes on what they'd learned. It reminded me of intelligence gathering techniques I'd been trained in, a systematic approach to collecting information about everyone in the community. My first real ally came in the form of my next-door neighbor, Sandra Garcia, a vibrant 38-year-old single mom who worked as an accountant. "Don't take it personally," she whispered to me after one particularly frustrating HOA meeting. "Karen has a system. New residents, especially women who live alone, get the special treatment until they learn to play by her unwritten rules." Sandra had been living in Ridgewater for 5 years and had compiled quite the dossier on Karen's inconsistent enforcement patterns. What she told me next, however, was far more concerning. "I'm an accountant, you know," she said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "And there's something really off about the HOA finances. The fees are nearly double what comparable neighborhoods charge, and I can't figure out where all that money is going." Sandra invited me over for coffee the following afternoon, where she showed me a spreadsheet she'd been maintaining for years. It detailed every announced community improvement project alongside photographic evidence of the actual work completed, or more often, not completed. "See this line item from last year?" She pointed to a $40,000 expenditure for playground equipment upgrades. "We replaced one swing set and added a coat of paint. I priced it out. That's maybe $5,000 worth of work maximum." Her analysis showed a pattern of inflated costs, phantom projects, and mysterious administrative fees that accounted for nearly 60% of the HOA's annual budget. "I brought this up once at a meeting 2 years ago," she said quietly. The next day, I received violation notices for 6 different infractions, all backdated to make it seem like I'd been ignoring previous warnings. The fines totaled over $2,000. I asked Sandra why she stayed in Ridgewater if things were so corrupt. Her expression turned sad. "My son has special needs, and the school district here has an excellent program for him. Moving would mean starting over with new doctors, new therapists, new support systems. Karen knows this, knows many residents have compelling reasons to stay despite the problems. It's part of how she maintains control. Her situation wasn't unique. Many residents had deep roots in the community or had made significant investments in their properties that they couldn't easily walk away from. The perfect captive audience for Karen's operation, whatever it might be. Things escalated rapidly after I caught Karen videotaping my house one evening. I was returning from an evening jog when I spotted her across the street, partially concealed behind a large oak tree, her camera pointed directly at my living room windows. When confronted, she claimed she was documenting potential violations but couldn't specify what those violations might be. The next day, I received a third notice, this time claiming my grass was a 1/4 inch too high, with a fine of $300. That was when I decided it was time to start my own investigation into Karen Harrison and her precious HOA. Using skills from my military intelligence days, I began discreetly gathering information about Karen. Public records searches revealed that she had indeed been a police officer with the county sheriff's department for 25 years, but had taken early retirement 6 years ago under circumstances that were suspiciously vague. Local news archives hinted at an internal affairs investigation involving excessive force and corruption allegations, but the details had been sealed as part of a settlement agreement. More interesting was what happened after her departure from law enforcement. Karen had quickly positioned herself within the Ridgewater HOA, rising to president within a year despite having only recently moved to the community. Coincidentally, that was when the HOA fees began their dramatic increase and enforcement became more draconian. I extended my research to other members of Karen's inner circle. Blake Mitchell had been dishonorably discharged from the Army Rangers 15 years ago after an incident in which he'd severely beaten a local vendor during an overseas deployment. He'd struggled to hold steady employment afterward until suddenly appearing in Ridgewater 5 years ago as the HOA's head of security, a position that hadn't existed previously and seemed designed specifically for him. The other board members were harder to evaluate. They appeared to be ordinary community members who had gradually ceded their authority to Karen, either through intimidation or simple apathy. What was clear, however, was that this HOA was functioning more like a fiefdom than a democratic neighborhood organization. As I dug deeper, I discovered something even more suspicious. Ridgewater wasn't unique. Several other HOAs in the region showed similar patterns: dramatic fee increases, selective enforcement, and leadership composed of former law enforcement or military personnel with troublesome pasts. The property management company that officially oversaw these communities was a shell corporation that led to a maze of other business entities, eventually disappearing into a web of offshore accounts. I was beginning to suspect this went far beyond simple corruption or petty power trips. The systematic nature of the operation pointed to something more organized, more deliberate, and potentially more dangerous. What I didn't realize was that my daughter had already been conducting her own investigation, one with much higher stakes than petty neighborhood politics. The truth began to unravel one evening when Brittany was returning home around midnight. From my bedroom window, I watched Karen intercept her in the driveway, demanding to know where she'd been and why she was coming home so late. She was questioning her like a police officer, which, as I would soon learn, wasn't a coincidence. Brittany's responses were calm but firm, refusing to provide details, which only seemed to aggravate Karen further. When I saw her step closer to my daughter, invading her personal space in a threatening manner, my protective instincts kicked in. By the time I made it outside, Brittany had already walked away, but the encounter left me deeply unsettled. Karen's interest in my daughter seemed to go beyond typical HOA busybody behavior. It felt almost like surveillance. The confrontation reminded me of techniques I'd seen used during my military career, intimidation tactics designed to provoke emotional responses that might reveal information. Karen wasn't just being nosy. She was interrogating my daughter with professional precision. When I tried to discuss the incident with Brittany the next morning, she downplayed it entirely. "She's just a control freak, Mom. Don't worry about it." But there was a new tension in her voice, and she spent the rest of the morning checking the windows and adjusting the blinds in ways that seemed far from casual. Later that day, I noticed her inspecting her car thoroughly before driving anywhere, running her hands along the undercarriage and checking around the wheel wells. Another counterintelligence technique I recognized from my own training. I recalled a conversation we'd had shortly after she moved in when I mentioned my suspicions about Karen. "Be careful around her, Mom," she'd said with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Some people take these positions of authority because they need to feel important, but others have more sinister motivations. At the time, I thought she was simply being protective, but now I wondered if she knew more than she was letting on. The question was, why would my daughter be interested in an overreaching HOA president, and why would she be equally interested in her? The following day, Brittany and I attended the monthly HOA meeting together. This time, I wasn't alone in my complaints about Karen's selective enforcement. A new resident named Michael Torres, a sharp-dressed lawyer who specialized in financial law, raised questions about the HOA's budget transparency. "As dues-paying members, we're entitled to see detailed financial statements," he argued professionally. "The summary reports provided don't meet standard accounting practices for nonprofit organizations." Karen's reaction was immediate and hostile. "The financial details are available to board members only," she snapped. "If you want to see them, run for the board next year." What happened next surprised even me. Michael calmly cited 3 specific state statutes that contradicted Karen's position. For a brief moment, Karen seemed genuinely rattled before regaining her composure. "We'll take your request under advisement," she said through clenched teeth. As we left the meeting, I noticed Karen in deep conversation with Blake Mitchell, a burly former ranger who served as Karen's unofficial enforcer on the board. They both watched us with undisguised hostility. What was most revealing about the encounter wasn't Karen's refusal, which I had expected, but the reaction of the other board members. Throughout Michael's questioning, they had exchanged nervous glances, their discomfort palpable. One woman, the board secretary, had actually begun to respond positively to Michael's request before Karen cut her off mid-sentence with a sharp look. These weren't willing co-conspirators. They were people caught in a system of intimidation who had learned to stay silent. As we walked to the parking lot after the meeting, Michael approached us casually, as if making small talk. "Interesting dynamics in there," he observed, loudly enough for others to hear, before lowering his voice. "We should continue this conversation somewhere else. Coffee tomorrow." There was an intensity in his expression that suggested this wasn't just neighborly friendliness. The meeting with Michael never happened. That evening, as Brittany and I were walking through the neighborhood, she suddenly took my arm and guided me toward a small playground. "Let's sit for a bit," she suggested, her tone casual but her grip firm. Once seated on a bench far from any houses, she leaned close. "Mom, I think our house might be bugged. Don't react, just listen." My blood ran cold, but years of training kept my expression neutral as she continued. "This is bigger than some local HOA scam. We're looking at a money laundering operation with high-profile ties. Accountants probably working around here too. Michael Torres is not who he seems to be. Neither am I." We noticed Blake Mitchell jogging along a nearby path, apparently by coincidence. Our conversation immediately shifted to mundane topics until he was out of earshot. "Tomorrow morning," Brittany whispered as we headed home. "Early, before sunrise, we'll talk then." That night, as Brittany and I discussed the strange meeting over a late dinner, I decided to press her about her mysterious job and odd hours. Before she could answer, she abruptly held up her hand for silence, then pulled out her phone and typed a message. "House might be bugged. Not safe to talk here." My military training kicked in immediately. We silently swept the main living areas, and sure enough, hidden behind a bookshelf was a small listening device. Brittany looked unsurprised, which only raised more questions. As we contemplated our next move, The house suddenly went dark, a complete power outage that affected only our home. Then came the unmistakable sound of someone trying to force open the back door. The darkness was absolute, no street lights visible through the windows, suggesting the outage was targeted specifically to our property. In the silence that followed, I could hear Brittany's measured breathing beside me, calm and controlled in a way that spoke of professional training. We communicated through hand signals, our eyes having adjusted enough to make out basic movements. The sound at the back door grew more insistent, no longer trying to be stealthy, but working with determined purpose to breach the entrance. I felt Brittany press something cold and metallic into my hand, a small tactical flashlight, the kind used by law enforcement. She then moved silently toward the kitchen, positioning herself strategically behind the counter with a clear line of sight to the back door. Time seemed to stretch as we waited in darkness, every sense heightened. I could smell the faint trace of aftershave as the intruder finally managed to force the door open, a distinctive scent I'd noticed before on one of Karen's associates at HOA meetings. Heavy footsteps moved deliberately through the kitchen, then paused as if assessing the situation. I remained frozen in place, controlling my breathing as I'd been trained to do years ago in situations far more dangerous than this. The intruder moved again, this time more quickly, heading toward Brittany's position. I tensed, ready to intervene if necessary, but my daughter clearly had her own plan. What happened next was like watching a different person emerge from within my daughter. Moving with practiced efficiency in the darkness, Brittany guided me to a defensive position, communicated through hand signals I recognized from my own military training, and approached the back door with a level of professional caution that no software developer would possess. When the intruder, a muscular man later identified as Todd Williams, managed to get inside, Brittany didn't panic. Instead, she strategically positioned herself to record their confrontation while appearing vulnerable. Rather than physically engaging him, she cleverly led him into making incriminating statements about being sent by Karen to check the security of our home. When local police arrived, led by Detective David Martinez, Todd maintained his story about conducting security checks, but the listening device and the fact that only our house had lost power painted a different picture. Detective Martinez was particularly interested in the listening device, examining it with expert attention. "This isn't amateur equipment," he noted, bagging it as evidence. "This is law enforcement grade surveillance tech, not something you'd pick up at an electronics store." He gave Todd a long, evaluating look. "And you say Karen Harrison sent you to conduct a security check?" The same Karen Harrison who used to work with the county sheriff's department. Todd's only response was to demand a lawyer, which Martinez noted with raised eyebrows. Before leaving, the detective pulled me aside. "I knew Karen back when we were both on the force," he said quietly. "There were concerns about some of her activities then. If you have any more trouble, call me directly, not the station." He handed me his personal card with a cell phone number written on the back. The exchange left me with the distinct impression that Karen's influence might extend beyond our neighborhood. As the police cars pulled away, Brittany carefully checked the perimeter of our home before allowing us to speak freely. "We should be clear now, but we need to be quick," she said, her expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "There's a lot I need to tell you, and we don't have much time." She pulled out a small electronic device and activated it, explaining that it would create interference for any remaining listening devices. "Standard counter-surveillance measure," she added, noting my surprised expression. "Not exactly standard issue for software developers, I know." After the police left, Brittany finally came clean. "Mom, I need to tell you something, but it needs to stay between us," she began, her voice steady but her eyes revealing the stress she'd been under. "I don't work for a software company. I'm with the DEA. We've been tracking a massive money laundering network that uses HOAs across the country as fronts. Karen Harrison isn't just a power-hungry ex-cop. She's a key player in an operation that's cleaning millions in cartel money and funding domestic extremism operations." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My daughter, my little girl who once made me macaroni art for Mother's Day, was an undercover DEA agent involved in a dangerous investigation. Part of me was terrified for her safety, while another part swelled with pride at her courage and capability. "I couldn't tell you before," she continued, "because operational security protocols are incredibly strict. Even now, I'm breaking rules by telling you this, but after tonight, I can't keep you in the dark. Your safety depends on knowing what we're up against." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. Her mysterious bruises from self-defense training, not kickboxing. Her odd hours dictated by surveillance schedules, not flexible remote work. The careful way she swept rooms for bugs every time she entered a new space. The weight of what she had been carrying alone hit me hard. "Why didn't your supervisors relocate you when I moved here?" I asked, struggling to process everything. Brittany's expression was grim. The coincidence actually provided better cover. A young woman living alone raises questions in a neighborhood like this. A daughter staying with her mom seems completely normal. But it complicated things too. "I never wanted to put you at risk." She hesitated, then added softly, "And honestly, Mom, having you here has been grounding. This kind of work can consume you if you're not careful." As we talked through the night, Brittany explained how the DEA had been monitoring this network for 18 months. The operation was sophisticated, using HOAs as perfect money laundering vehicles, places where large sums could move through dues, fines, and improvement projects without raising suspicion. Karen's position as an ex-law enforcement officer made her particularly valuable to the organization. She knew exactly how to stay under the radar of local authorities. Michael Torres, I learned, wasn't just a concerned homeowner, but another DEA agent placed in the community to support Brittany's deep cover operation. The timing of my move to Ridgewater had been completely coincidental, an uncomfortable complication for Brittany's mission that she'd been forced to adapt to. "Criminal organizations operate in plain sight," Brittany explained, sketching a diagram of cash flow on a notepad. They target HOAs because the financial oversight is minimal and resident participation in governance is typically low. Think about it. Who actually attends HOA meetings or reviews the financial statements? Most people just pay their dues and fines without question. The brilliance of the scheme was in its ordinariness. The HOA did actually function as an HOA, maintaining common areas and enforcing community standards. The criminal element was layered on top through inflated contracts, phantom projects, and excessive fines, all cash flowing into the organization's coffers, then out through a series of shell companies, emerging as clean money on the other side. The most disturbing revelation was about Karen herself. She wasn't just recruited because of her law enforcement background, Brittany said. The organization specifically targets former police officers and military personnel who left under questionable circumstances, people with skills and authority issues who feel betrayed by the systems they once served. They offer them power, respect, and money. Everything they feel was taken from them. Karen's psychological profile painted a picture of a person whose identity had been entirely wrapped up in her badge, who viewed her forced retirement as not just the end of a career, but an existential threat. The HOA presidency wasn't just a job for her. It was redemption, a reclaiming of her perceived rightful place of authority. Our conversation was interrupted by an urgent call from Sandra. "Ma'am," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "I just overheard Karen talking to Blake about taking care of a problem at your address. I think they're planning something. Be careful." Simultaneously, Brittany received an encrypted message from her supervisor, Agent Jessica Walsh, warning that their secure meeting location had been compromised. We were now potentially facing immediate danger from multiple directions. Brittany immediately switched to crisis management mode, implementing security protocols with practiced efficiency. "We need to secure the house without making it obvious we're prepared for them," she explained, checking the locks and setting up subtle early warning systems at entry points. If they think we're onto them, they might accelerate their plans or take more desperate measures. We spent the next hour preparing, not with guns or barricades, but with strategically placed furniture that would funnel any intruders into predetermined zones, improvised noisemakers that would alert us to movement, and escape routes planned and memorized. Throughout it all, I was struck by my daughter's transformation. The confident professional before me was a far cry from the little girl I had raised, yet I could still see echoes of her determined spirit in this capable agent. The night passed without incident, but the tension remained palpable. We knew we were being watched. Occasional movements of cars with darkened windows cruising slowly past our house confirmed as much. By morning, we had developed a plan of action that balanced Brittany's operational needs with our immediate safety concerns. The DEA couldn't move on Karen yet. They needed concrete evidence linking her to the larger organization, evidence that would stand up in court and help dismantle the entire network, not just its local manifestation. But we could no longer remain passive targets either. The next morning, Brittany introduced me to Michael under the guise of discussing the HOA's legal overreach. In reality, we were strategizing how I could help their investigation without compromising it or putting myself in unnecessary danger. We need concrete evidence linking Karen to the organization's leadership, Michael explained. We know the money flows through the HOA, but Karen has been careful to keep her direct communications with the higher-ups hidden. We need access to records she wouldn't include in official HOA documentation. This was where my military intelligence background became valuable. While I couldn't officially participate in a DEA operation, nothing prevented me from exercising my rights as a homeowner to ask questions and gather information, especially about improperly assessed fines against my property. Michael was younger than I had initially estimated, probably in his mid-30s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations. His cover as a financial lawyer wasn't far from his actual expertise. He had spent years tracking complex money laundering operations for the agency's Financial Crimes Division. Karen's made a critical mistake, he told us, spreading out property records on my dining room table. She's gotten comfortable, maybe even arrogant. The organization typically rotates their people through different HOAs every few years to avoid patterns. But Karen's been here for 5. She's developed attachments, routines, vulnerabilities we can exploit. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than trying to breach Karen's inner circle directly, we would apply pressure to its weakest points, the support staff and contractors who facilitated the operation but weren't true believers. Through Sandra's connections, we managed to arrange a private meeting with Timothy Chen, the HOA's accountant. A nervous man in his early 60s, Timothy initially refused to discuss anything beyond the public financial statements. It wasn't until I mentioned certain discrepancies Sandra had identified that his demeanor changed. "They'll ruin me if they find out I talked to you," he said, hands trembling around his coffee cup. "Karen has dirt on everyone. In my case, it's a gambling problem I had years ago. She threatened to expose it to my family and employers if I didn't help them." With careful reassurance from Michael about potential immunity arrangements, Timothy finally revealed the complex financial web. The HOA was just one of dozens across the country managed by a shell property management company. Funds flowed through multiple layered entities before eventually reaching offshore accounts. What made the operation virtually undetectable was that it operated under the guise of legitimate business. The HOA did actually function as an HOA, just with vastly inflated costs and mysterious capital improvement projects that never seemed to materialize. Timothy's information was valuable but still circumstantial. The breakthrough came when he mentioned quarterly in-person meetings between Karen and regional directors from the parent organization. "They never discuss business over phone or email," he explained. "Everything important happens face-to-face, usually in the HOA office after hours." The next meeting is scheduled for this Friday. This was exactly the kind of evidence the DEA needed, direct contact between Karen and higher-level operatives that could establish the connection to the larger criminal enterprise. But documenting such a meeting would be extraordinarily dangerous. These were people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use intimidation and violence to protect their interests. The deeper we dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Karen and her inner circle weren't just laundering money. They were systematically targeting vulnerable residents, particularly elderly homeowners living alone, with ever-increasing fines and special assessments. Patricia Manning, a wealthy 72-year-old widow, had been pressured into making a $100,000 donation to an HOA legal defense fund that didn't actually exist. Others had been forced to sell their homes at below-market values to mysterious cash buyers when they couldn't keep up with the mounting financial demands. Those buyers, Michael informed us later, were all connected to the same criminal organization. What made this scheme particularly insidious was how it exploited normal community dynamics. Most residents simply wanted a nice place to live and were willing to accept increasingly stringent rules and rising costs as the price of maintaining property values. Those who did question the system, like Sandra, were quickly targeted with selective enforcement until they fell in line or moved away. The resulting atmosphere of subtle intimidation created a perfect environment for the criminal operation to thrive. People learned not to ask questions, not to challenge authority, not to look too closely at the finances. It was social engineering at its most effective, using the mundane structure of suburban living as cover for something much darker. Karen's next move was to call an emergency HOA meeting where she formally accused me of suspicious activities detrimental to the community. The charges were laughable, everything from unauthorized surveillance of HOA officials, when I'd caught her filming my house, to harboring potentially unauthorized residents, my own daughter. But the real message was clear: back off or face consequences. Throughout her presentation, Blake stood menacingly by the exit, making sure everyone understood the unstated threat. What Karen didn't anticipate was that her heavy-handed approach actually generated sympathy for me among other residents, many of whom had their own stories of intimidation. For the first time, people were openly questioning Karen's authority, and she was visibly unsettled by it. The meeting became unexpectedly heated when Patricia Manning, the elderly widow who had been coerced into making the large donation, stood up to defend me. "I've lived in this community for 15 years, she said, her voice quavering but determined. "And I've never seen such aggressive enforcement until Ms. Harrison took over the board. Perhaps instead of investigating Mrs. Hayes, we should be looking more closely at where our money is going." Blake immediately moved toward her, but stopped when several other residents stood up in support. The mood in the room had shifted palpably, years of resentment bubbling to the surface now that someone had finally spoken up. Karen attempted to regain control, calling for an immediate vote on my probationary status within the community, but the motion failed when not enough residents supported it. As the meeting dissolved into multiple heated conversations, Karen and Blake made a hasty exit, their expressions dark with barely contained fury. When we returned home that evening, we immediately knew something was wrong. Though nothing was visibly disturbed, years of training had given both Brittany and me a sixth sense for when our space had been invaded. A professional search had been conducted, one that most people would never have detected. Brittany's encrypted laptop showed signs of tampering, though her security protocols had prevented any actual breach. On the kitchen counter was a simple note: "Continue, and there will be consequences." The message wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. The invasion of our home crossed a line. Brittany immediately reported the escalation to her supervisors, who authorized increased surveillance resources for the operation. "They're getting desperate," she explained as we conducted another sweep for listening devices. Karen's losing control of the narrative in the community, which threatens both her position and the organization's operations here. Desperate people make mistakes. The DEA now had enough evidence to justify increased surveillance of Karen, but they still lacked the direct connection to the organization's leadership needed for federal charges beyond money laundering. The breakthrough came when Brittany intercepted communications suggesting an in-person meeting between Karen and a high-ranking member of the criminal network, someone the DEA had been trying to identify for years. The meeting was scheduled to take place in the HOA office after hours, presenting both an opportunity and a significant risk. With formal DEA operations requiring warrants and approvals that might take too long, Brittany made the difficult decision to conduct reconnaissance on her own, with minimal backup from Michael. The plan was simple but dangerous. Brittany would access the HOA office under the pretense of dropping off an appeal letter for my latest fine, but would plant a small recording device. She would then leave and monitor the device remotely. I insisted on providing backup surveillance from my car across the street. My military experience made me an asset rather than a liability in this situation. What we didn't anticipate was Karen working late that night, catching Brittany in the act of placing the device. From my vantage point, I watched in horror as Karen drew a handgun and forced my daughter to her knees. Through the office window, I could see her on the phone, presumably calling for backup. There was no time to wait for Michael or other DEA agents. My daughter was in immediate danger. Using skills I hadn't needed since leaving the military, I approached the building from the blind side, entered through an unlocked maintenance door, and made my way to the office area. I could hear Karen's voice growing increasingly agitated. "I don't care who she is. She was planting something in my office. No, I haven't called the police. We handle this ourselves, like always." As I peered around the corner, I saw Karen standing over Brittany, gun still trained on her. What happened next unfolded with frightening speed. Blake arrived through the front entrance, followed immediately by a man I'd never seen before, someone whose presence caused Karen's demeanor to change completely. The stranger, later identified as one of the organization's regional directors, took one look at the situation and coldly ordered Karen to clean up this mess permanently. In that moment, Karen's facade of neighborhood authority figure dropped entirely, revealing the desperate criminal beneath. I stepped into the doorway, creating a momentary distraction. "Federal agents, weapons down," I shouted, gambling on confusion rather than firepower. Karen hesitated, her gun wavering between Brittany and me. That split-second delay was all Brittany needed. With a move I hadn't seen since my combat training days, she disarmed Karen while simultaneously triggering the emergency signal on her concealed communication device. Blake reached for his own weapon, but froze at the sound of multiple car doors slamming outside, the DEA tactical team responding to Brittany's signal. The unknown man attempted to flee through the back only to be met by more agents who had been monitoring the situation from a distance. In less than 30 seconds, the entire HOA office was secured by federal agents, with Karen, Blake, and the mysterious leader all in custody. The aftermath unfolded like a dream. As dawn broke, FBI vehicles filled the streets of Ridgewater Estates, and agents executed search warrants on multiple properties throughout the neighborhood. Residents watched in shock as their picture-perfect community was revealed as the front for a massive criminal enterprise. The regional DEA assistant director personally debriefed me, explaining that the operation had uncovered not just money laundering but connections to cartel money and international trafficking networks. Brittany, he informed me with obvious pride, had been instrumental in gathering the intelligence that made this bust possible, despite the significant personal risk. The subsequent investigation revealed the true extent of Karen's operation. Over 20 HOAs nationwide had been infiltrated by the organization, collectively laundering over $200 million annually. Karen, once a respected police officer, had been recruited after her dismissal from the force following excessive force allegations. Her police background and deep resentment toward the system that had betrayed her made her an ideal candidate for the criminal network. The psychological evaluation performed after her arrest painted a disturbing picture of a person whose need for control and authority had twisted into something dangerous. When her legitimate power was taken away, the HOA had given her a perfect replacement, a miniature fiefdom where she could rule unchallenged, all while serving the interests of her criminal associates. In the weeks that followed, I worked closely with Detective Martinez and DEA agents to help residents understand what had happened in their community. Many were in shock, unable to reconcile their quiet suburban existence with the criminal enterprise that had been operating right under their noses. Others expressed guilt for not questioning the increasingly suspicious activities earlier. "Don't blame yourselves," I told them during a community meeting. "This operation was designed specifically to exploit normal people's trust and desire for community order. The best thing we can do now is rebuild with transparency and genuine democracy." With DEA guidance, we established an interim HOA board, created new financial oversight measures, and began the process of recovering funds for residents who had been victimized by excessive fines and fraudulent assessments. The most moving moment came when Patricia Manning approached me after one of these meetings, tears in her eyes. "You know, I kept quiet for years because I thought I was alone, that maybe I was just a confused old woman who didn't understand how things worked anymore. If I had known others were experiencing the same thing." Her voice trailed off, heavy with regret. I took her hands in mine. "That's exactly how these systems thrive, by making each person feel isolated in their experience. But look around now. You're not alone anymore. The healing process for our community would be long, but it had begun, with people finally talking openly about their experiences, finding solidarity instead of isolation. Karen's trial 6 months later was the final chapter in our Ridgewater saga. I testified about the harassment, the surveillance, and the threatening behavior that had become normalized under her leadership. Other residents came forward with similar stories, painting a comprehensive picture of intimidation and abuse. When Karen took the stand in her own defense, she attempted to portray herself as a mere middleman who had been coerced into cooperation. That facade crumbled when the prosecution presented Brittany's recordings from the night of the arrest, clearly capturing Karen's willing participation in the criminal conspiracy. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: money laundering, conspiracy, extortion, illegal surveillance, and attempted murder. The judge, noting Karen's abuse of her position and betrayal of community trust, sentenced her to 28 years in federal prison. Today, Ridgewater Estates has a new HOA, one with transparent finances, democratic processes, and reasonable rules. I serve as a board member, using my experience to ensure that power is never again concentrated in the hands of a single person. Brittany has been promoted within the DEA and continues her work fighting financial crimes, though thankfully no longer undercover. Our relationship has grown stronger through this ordeal, built on a new foundation of mutual respect and understanding. The listening devices and security cameras in our home now are our own, part of a security system installed after everything settled down. Old habits from both our professional lives die hard. Sometimes I still can't believe how a simple move to a quiet suburban neighborhood led me into the heart of a criminal conspiracy. If there's one lesson I've learned from all this, it's that appearances can be deceiving. Whether it's a perfect neighborhood with its manicured lawns or a seemingly unemployed young woman who's actually working to bring down criminals from the inside. That, and never underestimate a mother's instinct to protect her child, or her ability to help take down an entire criminal network when pushed too far. Looking back, I realized the signs were there from the beginning. The irregular financial practices, the selective enforcement of rules, the intimidation tactics. What Karen and her criminal associates didn't count on was facing someone like me, someone with the training to recognize patterns and the determination to protect her family no matter what. Or someone like my daughter, whose intelligence and courage made her an exceptional agent, even on her first major assignment. Together, we proved that even the most well-established criminal operations have weaknesses, especially when they underestimate the people they're trying to control. For anyone watching who might see similar patterns in their own communities, unusually high HOA fees, selective enforcement, intimidation of certain residents. I'm not saying your neighborhood association is laundering money for criminals, but I am saying that you have rights as a homeowner, and unusual financial practices should always raise questions. Remember, legitimate organizations have nothing to hide from the people they serve, and if you ever find yourself facing a power-hungry HOA Karen with a suspicious past and a gun pointed at your family members, well, I hope they're as unaware as Karen was that they're messing with the wrong family.